I never thought small towns could hide such darkness. It's ironic, isn't it? People talk about the calm and peaceful nature of these places, how safe and serene they seem, until you experience the things I did. It started innocently enough when I moved to a small town in Ohio called Lakewood. It wasn't much, just a dot on the map with a handful of houses, an old diner, and one high school that barely had enough students to fill up a football team. I was new to the area, fresh out of college, just trying to get away from the city life for a while, figure some things out, and maybe find a little peace. I rented a small house on the edge of town, tucked away in a corner where the woods seemed to swallow up the path leading to it. At first, I didn't think much of it, the creaky floors, the shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too long in the corners of the rooms. But the oddities started to pile up, subtle things that nagged at the back of my mind. Little noises at night, scratching on the windows when no one was supposed to be there, and a feeling I couldn't shake that something was always watching. I remember the first time I saw him. It was late one evening. I had just come back from the diner, the air cool and sharp against my skin, the sky a bruised purple as the sun dipped low. I parked the car in front of my house and froze. There, at the edge of the woods, standing just beyond the line of trees, was a man. He was tall, too tall, and his posture was rigid, unnaturally so. The worst part? He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat, but I could feel his eyes burning into me, even from that distance. I did what anyone would do. I shook it off as some local wandering around, maybe trying to get a look at the new neighbor. But when I stepped inside and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. The next few days were strange. I didn't see him again, the tall figure standing at the edge of the woods, but the feeling lingered. Like the air in my house had thickened, each corner darker than it should have been, shadows clinging a little too tightly. The quietness of the small town, once comforting, now felt oppressive. People here were too polite, too reserved, as if they were hiding something. The neighbors were friendly enough, too friendly, maybe. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived across the street, would stop by almost every day, bringing me some homemade pie or talking about the weather. It was almost like they were too eager to welcome me into their little world. One afternoon, she invited me to a small town gathering at the local church, but something in her smile felt forced. "I think you'd fit right in here," she said, her voice sweet like honey but with a strange edge to it. "The town has a way of making you feel at home. You'll see." I politely declined. Something about the offer didn't sit right with me, but I didn't say anything, just smiled, thanked her for the pie, and watched her shuffle back to her house. It wasn't long after that I started to hear the noises again. At first, it was just faint, scratching on the windows, light taps against the walls. I figured it was just the wind, the house settling. But by the third night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like someone or something was trying to get in. I got up, heart pounding, and moved to the window. Nothing. The yard was empty, the darkness just as thick as the rest of the town. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, the stress of the move and the isolation playing tricks on me. But then the tapping stopped, and in its place I heard something far worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel path outside my house, as if someone was walking in circles around it. I held my breath, praying I was wrong, but the sound grew louder. It was coming closer. I peeked through the blinds, my heart racing, and saw a figure in the shadows. Not the tall man from before, but someone else. Smaller, hunched, and moving in a strange, jerky way. It stopped right at the window, and for a moment, everything went silent. I backed away, trembling, not sure if I was more afraid of what I had seen or what I hadn't. The footsteps continued for days. Every night, they circled my house, sometimes slow, other times fast, like something was toying with me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The house, which had once seemed so charming, now felt like a trap, a prison that I couldn't escape. I tried talking to the locals about it, but when I mentioned hearing noises or seeing strange figures near my property, they gave me these uncomfortable, knowing looks. Mrs. Peterson especially would just smile and say, "Oh, it's just the wind, dear. You'll get used to it." As if it was the most normal thing in the world. But it wasn't normal. One afternoon, desperate for answers, I went to the town's library, hoping to find some old records or something that would explain the oddities. The library was small, more of a dusty room filled with old books than a real place to research. But there was one section at the back that caught my eye. Old town records. Journals from people who had lived here for generations. I began flipping through them, heart pounding as I read about Lakewood's strange history. In the 1800s, the town had been founded by a man named Elias Walker, a reclusive figure who had a notorious reputation for conducting strange rituals in the woods. They say he was obsessed with immortality, and the rumors of his dark practices lingered long after his death. As I dug deeper, I found more accounts from townspeople who spoke of the Watchers, strange figures who would appear at the edge of the forest, never quite seen, but always there. And then there was the most chilling entry of all, a mention of something called the Keeper, a creature said to be bound to the land, feeding off the fear and isolation of anyone who lived there. The more I read, the more the room seemed to close in around me. I could feel a cold breath on my neck, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked up, nothing, but the unease was undeniable. As I stood to leave, a book caught my eye on the shelf above me. It wasn't old or dusty, but it looked out of place, freshly bound, like it had been put there recently. I reached for it, and the moment my fingers touched the cover, I heard it, the tapping, right outside the library window. I froze, the sound almost too familiar. The footsteps, the same rhythmic, deliberate tapping. I slammed the book shut and rushed to the window. Nothing, just the darkening town. But then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw him, the tall man, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, standing just beyond the trees, watching me. And that's when I understood. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't know what to do. The moment I saw him in the reflection, a cold, overwhelming fear gripped me, like I had crossed some invisible line. The man outside, standing so still, his posture unnaturally rigid, wasn't just a strange visitor. He was part of something much darker. I rushed out of the library, almost tripping over my feet, desperate to get back to my house. The small town seemed to close in on me with each step, the trees stretching their limbs as if reaching for me. The footsteps, now faint but unmistakable, echoed in my ears. As I reached my car, I turned around, half expecting to see the man right behind me. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the streetlights flickering to life. I couldn't stop myself. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. My mind raced, spinning with thoughts. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening in this town, and why I felt like I was being pulled into something that went far beyond my control. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the house was suffocating, but the unease I felt every time I closed my eyes was worse. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, when the sound started again. The tapping. But this time, it was different. It was louder, more insistent, almost like it was right outside my bedroom window. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got out of bed, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. Slowly, I made my way to the window, moving cautiously, as if each step would trigger something worse. And there he was, the tall man, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But this time, I could see something else. His body wasn't quite right. His silhouette was too thin, too elongated, his arms unnaturally long and hanging by his sides like they were just barely attached to his body. Couldn't look away. And then, the worst part, I saw his eyes. They weren't human. They were hollow, deep, black pits where eyes should have been. No whites, no pupils. Just endless darkness staring back at me, as if they were drawing me in, pulling me closer. A voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that felt like it came from within the walls of the house. "He knows you're here." Suddenly, I snapped out of the trance. I stumbled backward, my body shaking, and in a blind panic, I slammed the window shut. The tapping stopped. But I knew he knew. That night, I tried to rationalize everything, convince myself I was just losing it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I had seen him, and that was just the beginning. The next day, I did my best to keep it together. I forced myself to go to work at the small grocery store in town, trying to shake off the fear that had been gnawing at me. But it was useless. Every corner I turned, I felt eyes on me. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too long, like it was waiting to swallow me whole. At work, I tried to focus on the mundane tasks. Stacking shelves, greeting customers, pretending everything was fine. But every time I looked outside, I felt that familiar chill crawl up my spine. He was still out there, watching. That evening, I finally decided to confront Mrs. Peterson. Something in her smile, the way she had always been so eager to offer advice, to push me toward the town gatherings, told me she knew more than she was letting on. I had to know what was really going on. I knocked on her door, the familiar smell of freshly baked bread filling the air. She answered quickly, as if she had been expecting me. Her wrinkled face was framed by a warm, grandmotherly smile, but there was something in her eyes that made my skin crawl. It was like she was waiting for me to ask the right question. "Good evening, dear. What brings you by?" Her voice was sweet, but there was an edge to it now, like she was trying too hard to seem welcoming. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice unsteady. "Something's happening in this town. Something's wrong. People like you, they know more than they're letting on." She paused, her smile faltering for a moment, just a flicker of something dark crossing her face. But then, just as quickly, she was back to her warm, comforting self. "Oh, sweetheart, it's just the way things are here, the way they've always been. The town, it has its ways of keeping people, of protecting them." I didn't understand what she meant, but I felt the fear creeping in again. My instincts screamed that I needed to leave, but I couldn't. "Not yet. Are you talking about the Watchers?" I asked cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady. Her face went completely still. It was like I had struck a nerve, like something inside her was crumbling. She took a step back, pulling me into the house before I could protest. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll hear you." I had no idea what she meant, but the tension in her house was palpable. There were no sounds, no movement, just the stillness that enveloped the place like a thick fog. Mrs. Peterson led me into the kitchen, where the smell of bread and cinnamon still lingered, but I barely noticed it. My mind was racing, my senses on high alert. There was something here, something in this room. She sat down at the table, eyes never leaving mine. "You're not the first," she said, her voice soft and fearful. "Others have come before you, but no one ever truly leaves. Once they see him, they're bound to stay." I felt the air grow heavy, the words sinking in. "What do you mean? Who is he?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes flickered toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows outside. Something tall, impossibly tall, just like the figure I had seen before. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's the keeper. He's the one who watches over the town. And once he has his eyes on you, you'll never be free." Mrs. Peterson's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The keeper. I didn't understand what she meant, but I could feel the weight of her fear pressing in on me. She wasn't just telling me a story. She was warning me. "You can't leave," she said, her voice cracking. "Not once he knows you're here. Not once he's marked you." She looked at me with wide eyes, pleading. "You're already in his sights. He'll come for you. He always does." I shook my head, panic starting to rise in my chest. "Who is he? What does he want?" Mrs. Peterson took a deep breath, her hands trembling on the table. "He's a spirit, a creature bound to the land. Legend says he was created long ago to protect the town, to keep outsiders from getting too close to the dark things that live in the woods. But something went wrong. Something twisted. Now he's no longer a protector, he's a warden. And anyone who comes to this town, anyone who sees him, they become his. Forever. I felt the blood drain from my face as I looked out the window. The town was too quiet, too still. It was as if the air itself had become thick with dread, as though something was waiting to strike. The footsteps, I whispered, remembering the rhythmic tapping that had haunted me for so long. It's him, isn't it? Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. He's always watching, always waiting. The footsteps you hear, the tapping on your windows, that's him letting you know he's near. But he never shows himself fully, not until he's ready. And once he does, there's no going back. I backed away from the table, my breath quickening. I don't believe this. This is insane. This can't be real. She reached out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength for someone her age. You don't have to believe it. You'll see for yourself. He doesn't care if you believe. He'll make you see. I jerked away, my heart racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something was wrong. This wasn't just in my head. Just then, the door to the house slammed open, making both of us jump. Mrs. Peterson's face drained of color, and she stood quickly, her hands shaking as she looked toward the door. It's too late, she whispered. He's here. I turned toward the door, my body frozen in terror. And then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel, slow and deliberate, each one coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved toward the window, afraid of what I might see. But when I looked, there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. But then, a chill washed over me. It was like the air had turned to ice, and in the reflection of the window, I saw him, the tall man, his face still obscured by the brim of his hat, his body unnaturally thin, his arms hanging at his sides like broken branches. And the worst part? The eyes. Hollow, black pits staring right through me. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. He was here, in this house, watching me, waiting. Mrs. Peterson grabbed my arm again, her grip like iron. He's marked you now. You're his. Her voice broke. There's no escaping once he's decided. The room spun. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse right there. The tall man, the keeper, was standing outside, just beyond the window, staring at me with those hollow eyes. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I turned to Mrs. Peterson, her face pale and filled with the kind of fear I hadn't expected to see from someone who had lived in this town all her life. What do we do? How do I get out of here? Her grip tightened, and for the first time, she looked truly afraid. There's no escaping him once you've seen him. You can't outrun him. You can't hide from him. The town, it's already chosen. You're part of it now. The footsteps outside grew louder, more insistent. The tapping against the walls echoed in my head, the rhythm like a heartbeat that matched my own. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing through every possible escape. But deep down, I knew he would always be there, watching, waiting. Then, as if the universe itself had heard my desperation, a thought hit me like a lightning bolt. There was one way to escape, one final choice. I looked at Mrs. Peterson, my mind made up. Tell me everything. How do I get out? Her face twisted, as if she were about to say something, but she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the door. The footsteps were right outside now. He was so close. You have to give him something. It's the only way. Give him what? I demanded, panic clawing at my throat. She didn't answer at first. She just looked at me, her face full of sorrow and regret. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The town sacrifices its own. You have to offer yourself to him. It's the only way to keep him from taking you and everyone else. I stared at her in disbelief. Sacrifice? You're asking me to? My words caught in my throat. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It's the only way to keep the town safe. to keep him from taking everyone. I felt the weight of her words sink in, each one like a stone dropped into my chest. The town, the people here, they were bound to the keeper. They had been for generations, and now I had become part of it. I turned to the window, looking at the figure standing there, his eyes burning into mine, the shadows around him swirling like dark smoke. The choice was clear. There was no escape. The only way out was to become part of the darkness, to give myself to him, to the keeper. But as I stood there, frozen, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Suddenly, I understood. The keeper wasn't just watching me. He was feeding off my fear, off my desperation. If I could face him, stare him down, I might break the cycle. I might be able to survive. I turned back to Mrs. Peterson, my voice low but steady. I won't give in to him. I won't be part of this. I'll face him. Mrs. Peterson looked at me, her expression a mix of shock and sorrow. You can't. No one has ever survived the keeper. No one. But I didn't care. I had already made my choice. I wasn't going to be another victim, another name on the list of people who had disappeared into the town's curse. I walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped the moment I opened it. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and the figure was there, tall, silent, waiting. I stepped out into the night, facing him. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt nothing. No terror, no dread, just a quiet resolve. And then I said it loud and clear. I won't be yours. I won't belong to you. There was a moment of silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, he stepped forward. His form blurred, shifting like smoke, until he was just inches from me. And then he was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, but when I finally looked around, I realized something had changed. The town, the woods, the people, everything was silent, still, as if the curse that had held this place in its grip had finally been broken. I don't know if it was the keeper who had truly let me go, or if I had faced whatever twisted force that had been holding me. All I know is that I survived. I left that night and I never looked back. And I pray every day that I never hear those footsteps again.